Guys, welcome back to biology. Today we're going to be talking about evolution. We're actually moving into my favorite unit. We just finished our unit on DNA when we discussed mutations in bacteria and viruses. So now we're going to talk about evolution. In order to be successful for today's lesson, you're going to need your Intro to Evolution guided notes opened up. I suggest split screening between that and this video. And then when you've completed that, you'll go take your exit ticket for this lesson. So this is our introductory lesson. The exit ticket should be pretty easy. Remember, you shouldn't be using your notes or cheating. Just try your best on it because you can do corrections. So let's go ahead and get started with our work for today. Before we get into it, I want you to, in your notes, go ahead and answer this question. What do you think survival of the fittest means? So pause this video, come back once you've answered it. All right, now I'm sure we all have different answers on what that looks like. So I have a little comic to kind of help us decide what is survival of the fittest. We've got 4 different fish here. These are all different guppies. And these people down here are having a very heated debate about who is the most fit. So this guy says, Fins is the best because he is big and strong. And this lady says, no way, this guy Spot has fathered more guppies than the others and all of his offspring survived. This lady said, Speedo should win because he's so fast. And then this guy's like, no way, guys. Romeo has been hooking up with all the ladies. So go ahead and pause now and see if your answer to that question changes. Okay, so there are 2 acceptable answers here. The first being that it is our boy Romeo, right? Because when we're talking about survival of the fittest, we're talking about the ability to mate and produce offspring, not the strength or speed of an organism. So with that in mind, if Romeo is mating with lots of different females, then he is passing on his genetics to all of their offspring. Now, if you said that it was Spot, you could also be right, because Spot is having offspring that are surviving, and then they're likely to pass on those genes as well. And that brings us into our 7th unit, which is evolution. So our essential question for today is, how is there so much diversity in the world, and where did all of it come from? Hopefully by the end of today's lesson, you guys will be able to answer that question. Now, for our agenda, we're only going to focus in on part 1. Part 2, we're going to save for another day. So today we're just going to talk about what evolution is, what variation is, and what adaptation is. In a later class, we'll talk about Charles Darwin and his contributions to our understanding of evolution. Here are our learning targets. So you guys should be able to explain what evolution is and how adaptation and natural selection play into it. And again, these other 2 we're saving for another day. The reason for that, I know that you guys have a lot of work going on. I've gotten some feedback that some of the lessons take a while. So this is where your notes pick up. We're talking about evolution, and this is our definition for it: the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient ones. Now, you've probably seen an image that looks something like this, and it's supposed to show you the evolution of man. And we'll get into more detail about that later and why it's not the best image, but I thought this comic was funny. So go ahead and get that definition down, pause if you need to, and then we'll move on. So again, when we're talking about evolution, it's the belief that organisms have naturally and gradually changed over time. So if we started off with 2 organisms like this, and one of them ate shrubs close to the ground, the other tried to eat leaves from trees, then over time, you would have changes in the offspring that look more like this, where they acquire that useful trait that allows them to survive. Remember, evolution is not happening within an organism, but within a species. So if we want to talk about change over time, we can start with the telephone, right? Every single one of us has one, probably. You probably have more than one in your household. This is the one that I grew up using, a rotary phone. How exciting. Really terrible to use, so be thankful for the advances or evolution of the phone. So the first telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Here's an image of him using one of these phones. In the 1920s, we developed something called a switchboard, where we would have women or men who operate this board, and they would remove the plug, move it to another one to connect your call to whomever it was you were trying to reach. So these switchboards in the cities would allow you to connect to people around you. In the 30s through 70s, we developed the rotary phone. So this gave people specific phone numbers. You could just flip through, dial the number that you need. To be clear, I was not born in the 70s. I was born in 93, but my family had a rotary phone because my mom thought it was retro or something. It wasn't a great time. In 1966, the first cordless phone was developed. So this was one that you would carry around the house. You could use as long as you were in range of the base. In the 1990s, we got these blocky cell phones here that if you've ever seen, Zach Morris and Saved by the Bell, you've seen one of these. I used to sneak out to my mom's car and call my friends on hers because she would leave it in the console. Then we have the first flip phone in 95. Wasn't much to it. It was just a base that covered the dials. It's not like the ones that you see today. The first iPhone came out in 2011. And then today we have, the iPhone X or XS or whatever the new one is, 11, I'm not sure. But when we're talking about evolution, remember that is just change that occurs over the course of time. So we started with Graham Bell's first invention. Now we have these like pocket-sized computers that we carry around with us every day. So one of our big ideas is that scientists began to think that life could have changed gradually over time as well. And this is what evolution is. This is also in your notes, so make sure you're following along. So when we're talking about evolution in the context of biology class, we're studying it because it is a scientific theory that explains how organisms change, and it has a very broad base of evidence to support it. And we'll get into the evidence in future classes, but for now we want to know, how do organisms change over time? You guys will actually be developing these cladograms later in the class, but this is just to show you all of these things have sprung from pre-existing organisms based on their environment. So this is in your notes as well. Our first key idea here is that every organism has different traits that help them survive in the environment that they live in. So some traits help them get food and survive better than others. And new traits will show up when mutations happen in the DNA, and those mutations allow them to survive better. So this is when mutations are actually advantageous. If we have a mutation that allows this hummingbird to fly faster or to recognize more colors, then it's more likely to find the food that it needs or to reproduce. So any mutation that's beneficial plays into evolution. So if we're thinking about this idea, which of these polar bears are going to be more easily seen by their prey? And as you think about that, think about what the differences are in the pictures and the traits that they have. So go ahead and pause, and then we'll answer together. So I'm sure most of you said these polar bears over here, and the reason for that is their fur color allows them to survive more easily in this Arctic environment than it would in a grassy area. Another thing that you might have said is that the thickness of the fur and the fat on these guys will help them retain heat, whereas this guy might overheat. Now, another reason for evolution might just be the food that's available to the animals. So if both of these guys need to reach the food on this tree, we have a pretty obvious winner, right? This giraffe over here is going to get that food. This rabbit would starve out. So when we see all of these different organisms, there's so much range in what living things look like and what they do because of the things that are necessary for their survival. And that brings us to our second key idea. So evolution depends on this difference in traits between living things. All of the differences in traits within an organism or between them, we refer to as variation. So variation is the difference in the physical traits among individual species. So if you're playing along at home, which hopefully all of you are, You can try to think of variations between different breeds of dogs. So what are some differences between all of these breeds? Now, our next key idea is that evolution depends on more than just variation. It depends on adaptation. And you probably learned about adaptation in your environmental science class. But remember, adaptation is a trait or feature that allows an organism to better survive in its given environment. And that's the key here. If the environment changes, then the trait that's best adapted will also change. Right? So it's based on the environment they live in and how likely they are to survive within it. Just to give you an idea of some adaptations, living things that have bodies that are adapted for the places that they live and the things that they do. So if we look at this fish over here, this guy has gills so that they can remove oxygen that's dissolved in water and they can live underwater. Jellyfish have stinging cells that they can use to capture prey. The bones of birds are hollow and spongy so that they can fly. And then most Arctic animals have a layer of fat and a thick coat of fur to keep them warm in the Arctic climate. So all of these things that allow them to survive better in their specific environment, we refer to as adaptations. But remember, differences between organisms are just variations. All right, and our fourth key idea, and we kind of got into this a little bit last unit, is that mutations are the engine behind evolution. They are what drives it. So when we talked about mutations, we talked about genetic mutations, chromosomal mutations, and these have to happen in order for new traits to appear. So if a trait is going to be tested to decide whether it's advantageous in an environment, it has to show up in the first place. And mutations are the origins of those. So mutations are structural changes to a DNA sequence, which you guys learned last unit. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and some of them do nothing at all, like those silent ones that we talked about. There are a couple different causes for mutations. So firstly, you can have a replication error. That's when a letter changes or we add or remove, like we talked about with frame shift. You can have an error during meiosis, which causes chromosomal changes, which are larger mutations. And then there are environmental factors like radiation, exposure to UV light, and industrial chemicals. And remember, these different mutations happen at different rates in different organisms. Generally speaking, the longer their life is, the fewer the mutations over the course of that life because it takes more time to change. So let's sum this up. I want you to go ahead and pause the video. Tell me, just say it in your head, or tell your, mom, dad, sister, brother, whoever's in the room, a variation between organisms of this specific fox species. All right, so you probably identified fur color as one variation. You might have said the thickness of the fur, their size. All of these things are variations, right? Any difference is a variation. It doesn't have to help them survive. And this one right here is the first question in your exit ticket. So this is where we'll stop for today. Remember, you need to turn in your completed notes and you have to complete your exit ticket in order to get full credit for this class. The exit ticket will be posted in a separate post. As always, if you have questions, you can pop into office hours. Otherwise, see you guys on Thursday.